They found him face down in the red Oklahoma dust, a bullet in his shoulder and a dead man's name pinned to his chest. And not a single soul in the territory of Cimarron believed he was innocent. Not one. Except her. If you believe in second chances, in the kind of love that finds a man in his darkest hour and refuses to let go, then like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because every week, we bring you stories from the heart of the Old West that will move you to your very core. The year was 1874, and the Oklahoma Territory was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a land of burnt horizons and broken promises, where the wind carried dust and grief in equal measure, and where a man's reputation was worth more than his soul, and far easier to destroy. Caleb Holt had learned that lesson the hard way, at a price so steep it had hollowed him out from the inside, like a winter-killed cottonwood standing alone on a ridge. He had ridden these plains for 10 years with nothing but his horse, a Winchester rifle, and a silence around him so heavy that even seasoned trail hands would look away when he passed through camp. They said he never smiled. Not once in 10 years had anyone seen the corners of that weathered mouth turn upward. He had forgotten the shape of joy the same way a man forgets the face of someone he loved and lost, slowly, and then all at once. Caleb was 34 years old, though he looked closer to 45. The sun and the sorrow had done their work on him faithfully. He had broad shoulders that carried the weight of a decade of grief, hands calloused from rope and leather, and pale gray eyes that had once been described as stormy, and now were simply still, like a pond after the last ripple fades, and there is nothing left but flat, cold water. He worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, never staying long enough in any town to allow roots to form, never sitting at a supper table long enough to feel like a guest, let alone family. He kept his distance from people the way a wolf keeps its distance from firelight, drawn to the warmth but too wise and too wounded to trust it. The story of what broke Caleb Holt was well known in certain quarters of the frontier, passed from bunkhouse to bunkhouse like it troubled him. In the autumn of 1864, when he was just 24 and newly married to a woman named Grace, a band of outlaws had swept through his small ranch outside of Abilene, Kansas, during a thunderstorm so fierce that the cattle had broken through the fence and the sky had gone entirely black at 2 in the afternoon. They had taken everything, his livestock, his savings, the deed to his land. And in the chaos, Grace had been caught in the crossfire between Caleb and the outlaws. He had held her in the mud while the rain fell in sheets and the thunder rolled across the Kansas plain like the voice of a god who wasn't listening. And by the time the last outlaw had ridden off into the darkness, she was gone. He had buried her beneath a single oak tree at the edge of what had been their property, and the next morning he had ridden away and never returned. For 10 years, Caleb Holt carried that wound the way some men carry a pocket watch, close to the chest, checked often, never set down. He had no intention of healing. Healing, in his mind, would have been a kind of betrayal of Grace, a suggestion that the world could go on being beautiful after she had left it. And so he chose instead the cattle trails and the campfires and the long, empty miles of the frontier, where the land itself seemed to share his grief, all that vastness and silence and sky, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. It was in the spring of 1874 that everything changed, though it did not begin beautifully. It began in the worst way possible. Caleb had taken a job driving cattle through the Oklahoma Territory for a rancher named Silas Monroe, a fair man with a large operation south of Guthrie. The drive had gone well enough until the 4th week, when 3 of Monroe's bulls went missing overnight and were found the next morning on the property of a neighboring outfit belonging to a man named Fletcher Crane, a man with political connections, a short temper, and a long history of swallowing up smaller ranches by any means necessary. Fletcher Crane accused Caleb of stealing the bulls and selling them across the border, a lie so brazen and so perfectly constructed that it had 3 false witnesses standing behind it before Caleb could even unsaddle his horse. By nightfall, Caleb had a bullet in his shoulder from Fletcher Crane's foreman and was lying face down in the red Oklahoma dust with a dead man's name pinned to his chest, and the whole territory was being told that Caleb Holt was a cattle thief and a killer. The town of Millhaven, Oklahoma Territory, was the kind of small frontier settlement that existed in the margin between civilization and wilderness. A main street of sun-bleached wooden buildings, a livery stable, a general store, a saloon called the Red Spur, a small church with a cracked bell, and a jailhouse where the sheriff, a tired man named Ezra Potts, was trying his level best to hold the fraying edges of law and order together with not nearly enough thread. It was into this town that Caleb was dragged, half-conscious and bleeding, and thrown into the jail cell, while Fletcher Crane's men stood outside the window shouting that there ought to be a hanging before Sunday. He lay on the narrow cot in that jail cell for 2 days, drifting in and out of consciousness, the wound in his shoulder burning like a brand, and he thought in his delirious half-sleep that this was perhaps how it would end for him, and that there was a certain fittingness to it. A man who had been dying slowly on the inside for 10 years would eventually die quickly on the outside. He did not pray. He had stopped praying the night Grace died in the rain. On the 3rd morning, he woke to the sound of someone setting a tin cup on the floor beside the cot. He opened his eyes, and for a long moment said nothing, because standing on the other side of the cell bars was the most quietly remarkable woman he had ever seen. She was perhaps 28 or 30, with dark auburn hair pulled back practically under a calico bonnet, steady brown eyes that held neither pity nor fear, but something else entirely, something that took Caleb a long, confused moment to identify, because it had been so long since anyone had looked at him with it. She was looking at him with simple, honest concern, as though he mattered, as though the question of what happened to him was a question worth asking. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. She was the town schoolteacher, a widow herself, who had come west from Tennessee 6 years earlier with a husband who had died of fever before their first anniversary in the territory, leaving her with a small house near the church, a classroom full of frontier children, and a faith in Providence that had been sorely tested but never entirely extinguished. The people of Millhaven respected her the way frontier communities respect those who stay when everyone else runs, quietly, and with a depth that goes unremarked until it is needed. She had heard about the man in the jail, heard the accusations and the crowd's hunger for violence, and she had decided before the sun was fully up that she was going to go see for herself, because she had learned early that a mob's certainty was the least reliable thing on earth. She brought him soup from her own stove, cornbread wrapped in a cloth, and clean water. She did not immediately ask whether he was guilty or innocent. Instead, she asked if he could sit up. When he managed it, wincing, she asked if his wound had been properly cleaned, and when he said no, she sent word to the sheriff that she would be bringing her medicine kit, and Ezra Potts, who had known Margaret Whitfield for 6 years and trusted her more than he trusted most of the territory, let her in without argument. She cleaned and dressed the wound with a steady hand, while Caleb sat on the cot saying nothing, watching her with those still gray eyes, trying to understand what manner of person would walk voluntarily into a jail cell to tend a man the whole town wanted to hang. When she had finished and was gathering her kit, he finally spoke. He said, in a voice roughened by silence and pain, that she ought not to be here, that it wasn't safe, that Fletcher Crane had eyes and ears all over this town, and that being seen helping him could cost her. Margaret Whitfield looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said that she had been afraid of the wrong things before and had learned to be more careful about what she let frighten her, and then she left. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, she had not only been bringing him food and tending his wound, she had been asking questions. She had ridden out to speak with 2 of the older ranchers who had no love for Fletcher Crane. She had written a letter to the territorial judge in Guthrie. She had sat with Silas Monroe's wife, who confirmed that her husband had spoken highly of Caleb's honesty, and she had taken that testimony and organized it carefully, the way a woman who teaches children to read understands the power of words placed in the right order. She was building a case, quietly and without drama, the way a person builds a fence, post by post, one solid piece at a time, until the whole thing holds. Caleb Holt watched all of this through the bars of his jail cell, and felt something stirring in his chest that he did not recognize at first, something small and cautious, like a coal that has not quite gone out. He told himself it was gratitude. He told himself it was simply the natural response of a man whose life was being fought for. He was not ready to call it anything else. But Margaret came every day, and she talked to him the way people talk when they have decided not to be afraid of someone, directly and with genuine curiosity. She asked about where he had come from. She asked about his years on the cattle trails. She did not ask about Grace, not directly, but she mentioned once that she understood what it felt like to lose the person who had been your whole world, and in the silence that followed, something passed between them that neither of them attempted to name. 3 weeks after Caleb had been thrown into that jail cell, the territorial judge arrived in Millhaven, and what followed was not a trial so much as the dismantling of a lie, piece by piece, in front of the whole town. Margaret had done her work thoroughly. The 2 ranchers testified. Silas Monroe's wife testified. A young Mexican cowhand who had seen Fletcher Crane's foreman plant the bulls on Crane's own property and had been too frightened to speak until Margaret had knocked on his door and sat with him and his family for 2 hours, spoke through a trembling voice that nonetheless did not break. The 3 false witnesses, faced with the organized and documented truth that Margaret Whitfield had assembled with the patience of a woman who had nothing but time and righteousness on her side, crumbled one after another like old fence posts in a flood. Fletcher Crane was arrested before sundown. The charges against Caleb Holt were dismissed, and when the cell door swung open and Caleb walked out into the late afternoon light of the Oklahoma spring, the first face he saw was Margaret Whitfield's, standing at the edge of the crowd with her hands folded calmly in front of her, and those steady brown eyes watching him with quiet satisfaction, not triumph. Just the simple, grounded satisfaction of someone who had done what was right and found that it was enough. He walked to her. He stopped a few feet away. He said, very quietly, that he did not know how to begin to thank her. Margaret looked at him for a moment and then said that he could start by sitting at a proper supper table, because she suspected he had not done that in longer than either of them wanted to count. And something happened then that had not happened in 10 years, in 10 winters of silence and solitary campfires, and the long, empty miles of the frontier. The corners of Caleb Holt's mouth turned upward. It was not a broad smile. It was small and uncertain and a little surprised, the smile of a man rediscovering a muscle he had forgotten he possessed. But it was real, and Margaret Whitfield saw it, and she said nothing about it, which was exactly the right thing to do. He stayed in Millhaven. He did not plan to. He told himself he would rest until the shoulder healed fully and then ride on, because that was the life he had constructed, and he did not know another one. But days became weeks, and he found small reasons to remain. First, to help Silas Monroe repair fences damaged in a spring storm, then to assist the aging livery stable owner with his ailing horses, then simply because Millhaven was the first place in 10 years where he had woken up in the morning and felt, however faintly, that the day in front of him might be worth meeting. He took a small job as a deputy under Sheriff Ezra Potts, who was grateful for a capable man and asked no unnecessary questions. He fixed the fence around the school. He chopped wood for the church. He found himself, with some bemusement, becoming part of the small and sturdy fabric of a frontier community. And Margaret was patient with him in the way that only someone who has survived real grief knows how to be patient. Not pressing, not retreating, but simply present, the way a good fire is present, warming the room without demanding to be watched. They fell into the habit of Sunday suppers, then evening walks along the creek at the edge of town, then long, slow conversations on her porch as the Oklahoma sunsets turned the sky above the prairie into something that looked like a painting of heaven, all gold and rose and deep, aching blue. She told him about Tennessee, about the husband she had loved and lost, about the faith that had carried her through in the moments when it had nearly not been enough. He told her, slowly, piece by piece, about grace, about the rain and the mud and the oak tree at the edge of what had been his land, about the 10 years of silence afterward. He had never told anyone the whole of it before. It felt like setting down something very heavy that he had carried so long, he had stopped noticing the weight. By midsummer, the whole town of Millhaven knew what was between them, because a small frontier community always knows, and regarded it with the warm approval that such communities reserve for things that seem right and well-earned. Ezra Potts said nothing, but was seen smiling at nothing in particular more than usual. The old livery owner mentioned to anyone who would listen that Deputy Holt was a changed man, and that it was a good thing to see. The children in Margaret's schoolroom, who adored her with the uncomplicated devotion that children offer those who treat them with consistent kindness and respect, had begun calling Caleb the deputy who fixes things, which was perhaps the most accurate description anyone had ever offered of him. On an evening in late September, with the Oklahoma sky above them enormous and stippled with stars, and a cool wind coming off the prairie that carried the first promise of autumn, Caleb Holt sat beside Margaret Whitfield on her porch and held her hand for a long, quiet moment, and then told her that he had spent 10 years being certain that the best of his life was behind him, in the mud and the rain and the dark. He said that he understood now that grief was not a betrayal of the living, and that loving again was not a betrayal of the dead. He said that he did not know how to be a smooth-tongued man or a poetic one, but that he knew with the same bone-deep certainty with which he knew good cattle country from bad, that she had given him something he had not asked for and could not have found on his own. He said that she had given him back his own smile, and that a man who has not smiled in 10 years knows, when it returns, exactly what it is worth. Margaret Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the prairie and the stars. Then she turned to him and said that she had prayed in her hardest years for a man of honesty and substance, not a perfect man, just an honest one, and that Providence had answered her prayer in the most unexpected way possible by delivering him face down in the red Oklahoma dust with a bullet in his shoulder, and that this had always seemed to her to be the almighty sense of humor at its finest. And she laughed, and he laughed with her. And there in the vast quiet of the Oklahoma night on a small porch in a small frontier town, with the stars watching and the prairie wind moving through the dry grass, something that had been broken for 10 years was made, not new exactly, but whole in a different, deeper way. The way things that have been mended are sometimes stronger at the broken places than they ever were before. They were married in the small church with the cracked bell on the first Saturday of October, 1874, with the whole of Millhaven present, and Ezra Potts standing up as witness with an expression on his face that suggested he might be fighting back something embarrassing in his eyes. Margaret wore her best dress, the color of prairie sage, and carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that one of her school children had pressed into her hands that morning with enormous solemnity. Caleb stood at the front of that church in a clean shirt and his best boots and watched her walk toward him, and the smile on his face was not small or uncertain any longer. It was full and unguarded and lit him up from the inside the way a lantern lights a room, changing everything. They built a life in Millhaven that was not grand or dramatic by the standards of legend, but was profound by the standards of what actually matters. Caleb served as deputy sheriff with the quiet, steady courage of a man who understood both justice and mercy, because he had stood on the receiving end of each. Margaret continued to teach, and the children of Millhaven grew up learning to read in a classroom where the windows were always clean and the teacher believed without apology that every child carried something worth developing. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the Oklahoma sky do what the Oklahoma sky has always done, put on a spectacle of color and scale that made the smallness of human troubles feel exactly right, not diminished, but properly proportioned against something beautiful and immense. 3 years later, a boy was born to them, and they named him George, a strong, plain name for a frontier child. And he had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn, steady soul. And Caleb Holt looked at him on the first morning and felt something that was almost too large for his chest to contain, and understood at last that the capacity for joy had not been destroyed in the rain and the mud of 1864. It had only been waiting, the way seeds wait through the hardest winter, for the right season to return. Before we reach the final words of this story, we want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever been broken by loss and wondered whether the best of their life was already behind them. And tell us, what lesson did this story leave in your heart? Was it that second chances are real? That one act of courage and kindness can change the entire direction of a man's life? That love, when it comes to a wounded soul, does not demand perfection, only honesty and time? We want to hear your thoughts, because your words matter to this community just as much as the stories we tell. They found him face down in the red Oklahoma dust, and they said he was finished. They said a man like that was too far gone, too broken, too hollowed out by grief and years and loss to ever find his way back to anything worth having. And they were wrong. Not because life is always fair, or because happy endings are guaranteed on the Oklahoma frontier or anywhere else. Asterisk in the Oklahoma Territory, 1874, a cowboy found more than his freedom. He found his way home. Asterisk.